On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution for the partition of Palestine into two states, one of them Jewish. The resolution required a 2/3 majority of votes to pass, and surprisingly, the USSR, as it then was, Soviet Union, and its satellites voted in favour, so it passed. And then, following that, sometime later, the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, which is also known as the Declaration of Independence, was proclaimed by David Ben-Gurion, who was the Jewish leader of the time in that part of the world. And that was done on the 14th of May 1948. So that date marks the beginning of Israel as an independent Jewish majority state in the world today. On our opening slide, you'll see the top left-hand picture is a historic one of David Ben-Gurion actually making that proclamation in a room in Tel Aviv. The picture on the right is of the modern Israeli Knesset, their parliament. They have a unicameral, one-house system, 120 members elected proportionately throughout the whole electorate of Israel. We'll come to that later. I have actually been in that chamber. Oh, and I have also been in the room where David Ben-Gurion made that proclamation. You can see a big photograph hanging on the wall behind him, and that is of a very notable Zionist pioneer, Theodor Herzl, whom I'll mention later. So this is significant dates, and then the first Knesset, the origin of the modern Knesset, was elected 8 months after the proclamation on the 25th of January 1949. So these dates, and in particular the 14th of May 1948, these dates are significant in a history of modern Israel since its formation. But where does it really begin? Well, it seems that I've been learning about Israel and the Jews all my lifetime to date. I was brought up in a very narrow Christian group that had a great sympathy for the Jewish people generally and for Israel in particular, and who devoted a lot of time to understanding the Jews and Israel, who had a great appreciation for the Old Testament and how that ties in with the New Testament. I grew up with all this over many years, and although I have left that group, I feel I have moved on from that. I nonetheless value the heritage that I've had, and it is partly out of that that I bring you this tonight and all that I've learnt since. But I do want to acknowledge some particular sources for this address. I will mention at my outline that I'm talking first of all the formation of modern Israel. I'm going to give some acknowledgements. I will talk about the ancient historical background and then a modern historical background before I actually get into the modern history from 1948 onwards. I do want to leave a good deal of time for discussion as well, because it will be interesting to see just where this discussion goes. It could go in a number of different directions, and I want to leave time for that. And then I'll give a summary. In a way, this doesn't really feel like a Christian apologetics subject, but it does actually give the background to so much of the Christian faith and of the Christian faith as it faces the modern world. So it is relevant in that respect. So I'm not actually drawing conclusions from this talk or making some theological point. I'm going to let it speak for itself, but I will summarise at the end. Okay, so going on to acknowledgements. As I've said, I've been learning broadly in this subject all my life from the Bible and elsewhere. But in recent times I decided I would try and find out a lot more about modern Israel. So I've undertaken at least 2 free online courses through a group called Coursera. I don't know how you say that, Coursera or Coursera. It's a worldwide network of universities all around the world that offer free online courses of varying lengths in a great variety of subjects. Anyway, I got onto a couple that were done out of the University of Tel Aviv, and in particular I did The Emergence of the Modern Middle East, parts 1 and 2, by a Professor Eyal Nava of Tel Aviv University and another Professor Asher Sassa of the Moshe Dayan Centre. And then I did another course 2 through that same organisation, The History of Modern Israel from an Idea to a State. I have done other relevant courses as well that add to all this. But I've done quite a lot of reading, and in particular, not long ago, I borrowed this book from the library, which I thoroughly recommend. It's called Israel, A History, and it's very largely modern Israel. There's a couple of chapters devoted to the lead up to 1948, how the Jews accumulated, as it were, in the land, and to the point at which the mandate was taken back and Israel became independent. It is written by a lady, Anita Shapira. She is a Jewish person. Interestingly, she's an older lady now, still alive in Israel, but she was born in Warsaw, Poland. She was a Polish Jew in, would you believe, 1940. So you can imagine what that time was. It was the time of Nazi occupation of Poland. The Holocaust was well underway then. How she survived that, and whether her parents and other relatives survived, I don't know, but somehow she survived. And she emigrated to Israel with adults, of course, in 1947. She went to what was not Israel then, it was the mandated area, Palestine. But somehow she survived the war and the atrocities that the Nazis inflicted on the Jewish people in Poland and elsewhere. I've not heard her story about that. I'd be interesting to know that one day. I have actually had personal communication with this writer, though I never got to meet her. She wrote this book. She's a professor. She became a professor in 1985 in Tel Aviv. And she's lived in Israel since 1947, a long time. But it's thoroughly worthwhile reading this book, even if it is a long read. It's very well documented. It's quite academic, I suppose, but readable. I read another book of hers after that. This one is about Ben Gurion in particular, who's subtitled here, Father of Modern Israel. That was a very good book too. Gave me a better understanding of him as a full person, a very interesting character. He was also a Polish Jew. Okay, so I recommend those two books, and that's a picture of Anita there. I have heard her speaking at conferences and that. We've also recorded on YouTube, so I commend that to you. Okay, look, I also need to acknowledge Wikipedia here. I haven't really learnt from Wikipedia, but it is a very useful source of summary information. You can quickly get material needed, which I've used as sort of like factual information to put into my address, plus a good many illustrations as well. So I do acknowledge Wikipedia. One thing that Anita says in this book is that of all the states created after 1945, Israel is one of the few that has maintained a democratic regime, and it is a democratic country. In that respect, it's a shining light in the region where it exists. Israel is unique. It's the only Jewish majority nation in the world today, and that's something that hasn't existed for 2,500 years. So, to give a little bit further background to this, I want to mention some Old Testament prophecy. Just recently, my daily Bible readings have taken me through the Old Testament book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel prophesied and wrote about 500 to 600 years before the time of Christ. And in particular, I want to share with you one prophecy that's in that book, in chapter 37. The whole of the chapter is worth reading, but it's not alone. It's one of many prophecies in the Bible which all add together to tell us something like this. Ezekiel was an exile in Babylon after Jerusalem had finally fallen and been completely destroyed by the Babylonians and the people carted off. So he was a captive living in exile. He wrote this. It was a part of a vision he had. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of dry bones. Have you heard of the vision of the valley of dry bones? Well, this is it. And he, the Lord, led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. That should be asked. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. He said that when this word was spoken to these dead, dry bones, the prophet thought was completely lifeless, that flesh would come onto them, sinew and skin, and they would be raised up, still be dead, and then God's breath would breathe into them. He said, say, I will make breath enter you, you will come to life. It gives quite a lot of detail about all this, but eventually it says the interpretation of this vision, these bones are the people of Israel, who say they are completely dead and useless and never will live again. God says, I will bring you back to the land of Israel. You will live, and I will settle you in your own land. This is what the Sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone or been driven. I will gather them from all around and bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. There's a lot more information in that chapter and just around that too, but I'll leave it at that. So that's one of the prophetic words that are background to what has happened to Israel. It was a time of catastrophe in Ezekiel's time because the last remaining Jewish nation at the time, called Judah, with its capital Jerusalem, came to a catastrophic end. The people were virtually annihilated. Those who lived there, Jerusalem was completely destroyed. The intention of the Babylonians was to make Jerusalem impossible to ever live in again. They tore down its walls, its defensive walls, burned everything they could, burned every building that was burnable, and pulled down the rest. They killed many, many people that were there. They destroyed the temple, which was the centre of Israel's worship, and they carted off the remaining people to Babylon, which in those days would be like taking them to the moon. It was so far away. Babylon, the Babylonians, were the superpower of the day, and Israel was just a little nation that now had come to nothing. Now look, I want to just review a bit more of the history of ancient Israel and the Jews, to go back a bit further than that. So I want to mention, I'll try and briefly recap this because it really is important to see how this all fits into where Israel is in the modern day. Now, the Hebrew people, or the Israelites as they were then called, or as we know them, they were later called Jews. The word Jew itself comes from Judah, which was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were in the land of Israel, in that area, over 3,000 years ago. Initially as a loose confederacy of 12 tribes led by an intermittent succession of charismatic leaders called judges. This is all in the Bible, and as you go on in time, from that time on, so there is increasing amount of archaeological evidence to corroborate the Bible story or to shed light on different aspects of it. So this is as far back as you can really go in that territory. So they were a loose confederacy. But then they became a monarchy, and the first king was Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was appointed in about 1050 BC. This is how far back we're talking about. And next after him was David. The picture down there on the lower left shows is a modern stained glass window picture of King David playing his harp, because he composed a lot of psalms. But King David was from the tribe of Judah. He followed Saul, and it was he who established the capital at Jerusalem in about 1000 BC. The Jewish people are the only people who have ever had Jerusalem as the capital of their state. Israel's golden age covered the reigns of David and then his son Solomon. And the map there on the top left shows the extent, roughly, of the kingdom of Israel. So as well as what is Israel today, it extended right up into what would be Lebanon and over towards Syria. At various times it encompassed more of this territory over here. It included all of the West Bank, and it included all of modern day Jordan, the ancient countries of Ammon and Moab and Edom down here, and down towards Egypt as well. So that was the United Kingdom of the one nation called Israel, with its capital at Jerusalem. Now, following Solomon, the kingdom split in two. The northern 12 tribes were more prosperous, and that they covered this territory here roughly. There's the Lake Galilee, here's the Dead Sea, this is the Mediterranean Sea over here. Is that showing on the screen as I do that? Yes, good. So Israel, that retained the name Israel, but they were less faithful to their heritage. And they had a capital at Samaria, north of Jerusalem, about there where the pointing the arrow. The remaining two tribes remained faithful to David's dynasty and more faithful to the heritage they had. They weren't faithful to it, but they were by contrast with the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, they were much more in line with their heritage. And their capital remained Jerusalem. So it continued like this for hundreds of years. Then the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel lasted about 200 years before it ended catastrophically in 722 BC, overthrown by the Assyrians, who came from some part of modern-day Syria, way up in the northeast. And so they completely destroyed Samaria, deported all the people and drew in other people, non-Jewish, to replace them. This is the way they ran their empire and subjugated its people. The 10 tribes there's argument about this, but they were pretty largely lost to history because of their syncretism and their intermarriage. Over generations, they just simply lost their Jewish heritage by and large. Some of them did come down into the southern kingdom. They came down and they emigrated into Judah if they were able and became incorporated into that continuing Jewish kingdom. But the rest were gone. And the people who came and replaced them were what are called Samaritans, and they form a group in the New Testament who were antagonistic to the Jews. It gives a little background to where they came from. They were brought in by the Assyrians. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah here lasted until about 586 BC. This is 2,500 years ago, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, as I've mentioned, exiled the inhabitants, another catastrophe. Altogether, an independent Jewish kingdom had lasted over 400 years. That was the end of an independent Jewish nation on the earth. The Babylonians, the major world power of the day, intended, as I've said, to destroy Jerusalem, never to rise again. I've recently undertaken another online course available also through the University of Tel Aviv, looking specifically at that period just leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, its fall and rise again, how it recovered just very, very slowly from that, and the archaeological evidence for all this about Jerusalem and Judea. A very interesting course which I've only not long ago finished. They also destroyed the temple. Now I've got an illustration there. That's the temple that Solomon built and that had remained the centre of Jewish life. It was in Jerusalem on what is now known as the Temple Mount, now a Muslim site. But that beautiful and very highly regarded temple was there. That was the centre of their cultural and religious life for hundreds of years until it was destroyed. I've just put a map of modern-day Israel over here for comparison with those other two maps, so you can see where it is similar and where it is different. And once again, Galilee's up in the north and the Dead Sea down there, and Jerusalem about here. Okay. The Jewish people, however, survived all this and they retained their identity, which is pretty amazing for 2,500 years after such catastrophes. 2 generations later, some of them, relatively few, returned to Israel, though many stayed and settled in foreign lands. The Jewish communities that still exist today, they're very tiny now, but they were large in modern times, in Iran and Iraq, have a continuous history for 2,500 years. They're the oldest, longest continuing living communities of Jews in the world, in various cities in Iran and Iraq. They were continuing there, more or less okay, until modern times, until Israel was formed and things changed. So they survived in their dispersed state, and retained their identity. They were always kind of second-class citizens, but they were relatively safe and they got on in some places. Those who returned to Israel were never able to govern their own affairs again, except for one brief period under the Maccabees before the time of Jesus. Otherwise, they were subject to the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans in turn in their empires. The Romans were ruling in the time of Jesus, so that's the background of the New Testament. By the time of Jesus, Jerusalem had been rebuilt and many Jews lived there and elsewhere in what you'd call the land of Israel under Roman rule. However, there were also many non-Jews too, more in some parts, for example Samaria, than others. So it's quite mixed in the time of Jesus. The Romans generally ruled this area of their empire with an iron fist, but there was always trouble. They had an iron fist everywhere and maintained a very strong grip on all the peoples they'd subjugated, but it was generally peaceful. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, but not in Israel. In Israel, that land, there was always trouble with the Romans. Eventually, the Romans had enough of these very difficult Jewish people, or segments of the Jewish people who were very difficult, and they decided to end Jewish existence there once and for all. They besieged Jerusalem and in AD 70 destroyed the city. They did another job just like the Babylonians, perhaps even more so because things had advanced a bit, but they used all their strength and their military might and their engineering ability to tear down what was there, burn and destroy it, kill people and cart people, drive people off into exile. And so it was the second catastrophic destruction of the city carried out by a superpower of the day, and with the intention of making any continuing life there impossible. I have heard that they even sowed salt all around the fields, everywhere around Jerusalem, so nothing would grow. And that's how they went about it. No Jew was left there or anywhere around Jerusalem, and they weren't allowed to go there. There were some Jews in more remote parts of the land of Israel, particularly up around Galilee and that region up there, over small groups. The last group of defiant Jewish rebels held out in the amazing desert fortress of Masada. You may have heard of that. There's very dramatic pictures of Masada, this what you'd think would be, what they no doubt thought was impregnable fortress. You might not have been able to do much from there. They thought that being in there on the top of this rocky, with precipice all the way around it and walls, they'd be safe. Well, the Romans expended no effort over years in actually getting up to that, breaching the walls in order to get rid of them. I believe when they breached the walls finally and got in there, they found everybody had committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Romans. That was the end of Masada. The saying in Israel is, Masada will never fall again. Whatever happens, they will fight to the end, as that lot did, unsuccessfully. The Jewish people who lived at that time in the land of Israel underwent a second diaspora. A diaspora is the word meaning dispersion, so they would spread because of either fleeing from the Romans or driven by the Romans. Those who were left alive, they went to all parts of the Roman Empire. Now I do have a picture here, another map. Okay, no, that's not very clear, I'm sorry, but if you can look closely at that, that's showing the various exiles from Jerusalem, the background for the diaspora. First of all, with the with the Assyrians up this way in red, the Babylonians in blue, and then finally the Romans. And as you can see, they went to all parts of the Roman Empire, to Rome and beyond over to Spain and what was Spain and Gaul, then up into what is now Germany, everywhere in the Roman Empire. So everywhere, and even before the time of Jesus, Jews were all through the Roman Empire, a minority in every place, gathered in cities, but they were always an identifiable minority. Okay. And so this has been the case for over 2,000 years. From there they've been dispersed further to Britain and then finally to America and Russia and all the Russian territories, and not so many over to the Far East that way, but throughout all that area of the world I've described, and then also to South America and Australia and everywhere else. The Jewish people have been scattered through the world, virtually anywhere but Israel. They've had a very unusual history, a unique history. They've been everywhere a minority and generally held aloof from mainstream society, both because of reasons that are applicable to them and for reasons of the bulk of society, the way they regarded them as well. They've been subject to discrimination, persecution, restriction. They've always been identifiable, distinctive by culture and religion, occasionally prospering, but generally downtrodden and unsure of themselves. Now this is where I should mention these other illustrations I've got here. That is a bas-relief from the Arch of Titus in Rome. It's a Roman monument, which I have seen, and it shows the Roman soldiers at AD 70, after they had destroyed the temple, carting off, and you can see there the menorah. The menorah is the seven-branched candlestick. This is one of the few representations of what the candlestick, that holy object, might have looked like. It's written about in the Bible, but never, there's no picture of it, of course. So this is where people get the idea of what it actually looked like. They carted it off as booty with all the Jewish captives and paraded them through Rome and enslaved them and so on. And that's part of their booty that they took away triumphantly to Rome. As I said, the Jews were always identifiable, separate from the rest of the population, particularly through application to their religion. And they read from the Old Testament, Torah here, and other writings. And their experience really, it's in a sanitised version. You see that if you've ever seen the film Fiddler on the Roof, it's worth seeing. It's quite a lovely musical, but it really does give some impression, though sanitised, of the experience of this minority in the Russian territories and the pogroms that just seemed to come out of nowhere, and they were just forced to pack up and move on. And you can imagine what kind of persecution and difficulties there'd be associated with that. That's a picture of one of the lead characters in that, a fellow called Tevye, and when it was first produced on Broadway. He's not the character, he's not the actor in the film. But anyway, that's the background of that. I wanted to just go back here and mention the prophecy. It was written back in Deuteronomy, back at the time of Moses, before they'd even gone into the land over 3,000 years ago. Moses lays before us kind of a prophecy, said, they were given the law, and it said, well, if you obey that and follow God's way, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed. And this is what it says about the curse. If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will scatter you among the nations from one end of the earth to the other, and among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. That really has described overall the experience of the Jewish people for 2,500 years. They've been expelled from every country of Europe at one time or another. When we talk about expulsion, we're not talking about expelling a couple of individuals who've transgressed the law in some way, committed a crime or other, but we're talking about a whole people who are just told, get up and go. And of course, you can imagine what kind of situations there'd be around that, if people take their neighbours and others taking advantage of them, having to sell property that they couldn't take with them, and trying to get things into something convertible, money or jewels or something to carry with them, how they'd be liable to attack by thieves and bandits and anybody trying to take it away. It would have been terrible. Well, they've been expelled from one country after another, including England. England in 1290, Spain in that momentous year 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That was the year too that the Catholic Christian power in Spain expelled them from Spain. Spain at that time was very wealthy and the superpower of the day. They got rid of them. A good many of them went to Turkey, actually, and they went wherever they could. It was a terrible time for them. And surprisingly, over the centuries, the Jews have fared much better in Muslim countries than they have in so-called Christian Europe until modern times. Modern times have changed the scene entirely with regard to the Muslim nations, but they did quite well really in Turkey and Egypt and other Muslim countries, Iraq, Iran, Persia as well. They were always second class and they were never equal to the Muslims, but they rose quite high. They prospered generally. They were left in peace to organise their own community. They were allowed to have their synagogues and so on. And that's been like that for a long time, not like Europe. Perhaps the worst place where, until in modern times, for the experience of the Jews has been Orthodox countries, Christian Orthodox countries like Russia. And as I mentioned, the movie Fiddler on the Roof gives some idea of what they faced in Russia. Now let's just go on here. So now we come up to the more modern period. I want to say that in 1880, and this was something new to me, I found out this from Anita. In 1880, the world Jewish population was around 7.7 million. It's quite a lot of people. In 1897, the first Russian imperial census was conducted. There were 5.2 million Jews in Russia. So by far the majority of Jews in the world around 1900 were in Russia, not in Europe at that time. And they were discriminated against. They were forced to live in what was called the Pale of Settlement. You know, the words beyond the pale actually come from this. They established this area. It was sort of in southern Russia and western Ukraine, around that area. Said, you've got to live here. And nearly all of them did. 4.9 million of them did live in the Pale of Settlement. There were three major waves of pogroms which killed tens of thousands of Jews in Russia and Ukraine. And this is one of the events which in modern times really precipitated the move to find a homeland for the Jews that makes things different from what they'd been prior to that time. 1880 to 84, 1903 to 1906 and 1980 to 20 were these three waves of pogroms throughout a lot of Russia. Of course, that's the tip of the iceberg, because underneath that is a great deal of oppression and discrimination and so on, keeping them down. And then more than 2 million Russian Jews emigrated in the period of those pogroms, 1881 to 1920, but only a trickle went to Israel. Most of them went to Europe. They were more mobile then because of technology and political change. They were more able to move. They moved across the border into Germany and other European countries, either settled there or moved on from there to England, and very many went to America. A great many went to America. How is it that the Jews, or enough of them, have returned to the land of Israel then to create their own state? How has it come about? We've seen how that they felt like the valley of dry bones, and you could see that their history over 2,000 years has been a fulfilment of Bible prophecies, like the Deuteronomy passage I looked at as well, because it's clear the Bible record is that, well, they did disobey God and they did dishonour God, and that's the culmination of that is that they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, their King, and so this has come upon them. Now, this is not to exonerate the people that have brought persecution on the Jews. I think that's very wrong, but nonetheless, it is a fulfilment of what was said all those years ago, and they've certainly experienced that. Well, how do they get from being in this dispersed state to coming back to Israel? Well, you could say that, well, God brought it about in accordance with Bible prophecies, like the one we saw in Ezekiel, and there's many others. But God does things by certain proximate means, so we're going to look at the human factors involved. Well, there's a man called Theodor Herzl. This is his picture here. He was a Hungarian Jew. He was secular. He was pretty well assimilated in society, being well educated. He was quite well off, and he lived in Vienna. And he in particular became very concerned about the terrible plight of so many of his fellow Jews. He was doing all right personally, but many others weren't, especially in more remote parts. It was a time of growing nationalism generally. Many ethnic groups were seeking to establish their identity and independence from the ruling empires, like the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire with all its minorities. But the difference for all the others is that they had a place within the empire where they were in the majority. So it was logical that the Greeks, when they wanted to become independent, they were part of the Ottoman Empire actually, but they had their own bit of land. Various others, the Serbs, the Croats, these ethnic groups that comprised this great empire, they all had bits and pieces where, though they were subject to the power of the empire, they were in a majority somewhere, so they could agitate for recognition. The Jews had no such place. Everywhere they were a minority. So they had no natural homeland, and they were scattered. In 1897, Herzl was instrumental in forming the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, with a view to build support for a Jewish country. Discussions, congresses, writings, etc. went on for the next 50 years with many ups and downs. Herzl in particular was persistent. Various places were proposed for a location of a homeland. And one of the most prominent was Uganda, believe it or not. I understand that the area they were looking at is actually within modern-day Kenya, but back then it was called Uganda. It was called the Uganda Plan. And the powers that be were approached for support. Could they allow a certain territory for Jews to go to and live? Okay, so they were looking at all these things. At the same time, there were some people movements, mainly fleeing very negative situations like the wave of pogroms in southern Russia that I'd mentioned from 1881 onwards. Some, but by no means all Jews, went to the land now known as Israel. The land then was a remote province, Palestine, of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which itself was in long-term decay. But even for considering the Turkish Empire, this was a remote part of the Turkish Empire, and for several hundred years it had been a neglected, underdeveloped, sparsely populated area. There were Arabs in the area, not so great in number, but in 1800, some scholar has worked out that there were about 250,000 inhabitants in that whole land, including 6,500 Jews. So this is in 1800. So there's a tiny minority of Jews there right back in 1800, 2,000 years ago. Now the first Aliyah is a Hebrew word meaning going up. That's the word they use for going up to Jerusalem. The first Aliyah was in 1881, an estimated 60,000 men and women, at last of whom that went to Israel. At least half of whom, maybe 70%, moved elsewhere. They found it so difficult when they got to Israel. They were pretty poor when they went there and wretched, but they were keen to make a go of it somewhere where they could call home. And they found conditions so difficult that 70% of them moved on. But there were some. That's known as the first Aliyah. The second Aliyah was from 1904, after the next pogrom, and another 40,000 over the next decade, of whom more than 60% left. So once again, it was a very small beginning in the Palestine. They were generally poor, life was very hard for them. Further Aliyahs followed. With the third Aliyah, which was also largely from Russia and Russian territories, 1919 to 23, it's just after the Russian Revolution. Many Jews participated in the revolutionary activities and are quite prominent in the communist revolution. And the idea of collectivism was prominent in their thinking, and that's when the kibbutzim, the collective settlements where nobody owns anything and they all worked collectively, kibbutz developed from that time, and moshavim, which is a similar thing to a kibbutz, but a moshav is a similar collective, but with not quite the same. It does have some private ownership. Okay, and they've been, until early on in the state of Israel's history, they were very successful. I think, this is my side, that there was a true communism existed in the kibbutzes, and it was very successful, as you could expect, but only because their backs were against the wall. If they didn't actually cooperate with one another and they didn't actually give of their all, then it would never work. And the moment the pressure was off, the moment they prospered, they did prosper, and life was easier, then people sit back and say, well, someone else can do it. Why should I bust my guts to do this or do that? Thank you, Ed. Let someone else do it. So eventually the kibbutzes they've all run out of steam long ago now. But initially they were very successful because they're so efficient when everybody does pitch in. Okay, so this is 1919, around that period, the third Aliyah. By this time, the Ottoman Empire was over and the British were in control. This is just after World War I. The British overthrew the Ottomans, took the Holy Land, and then the fourth Aliyah was a much bigger movement of generally better off immigrants. Many came from Poland, and one of the reasons for that was the USA had just closed its door to immigration, to Jewish immigration. Up to that time, they'd been saying, all the wretched of the world come to our shores, and so Jews and many others came. That period, just leading up to the Depression as well, they said, "No, we've had enough. You can't come here." So the Jews who wanted to get out of Poland, where there was so much anti-Semitism even then, a good many of them went to Israel. As Jewish migration continued, relations with the local Arab inhabitants deteriorated. Now, this wasn't the intention from the start. Many of the pioneers had hoped that they'd have good relations with the Arabs. In fact, they thought that through their own industry and organisation, coming from a very poor situation themselves, that they would actually take the poor Arab neighbours with them and be of benefit to them. It didn't work out like that. So there was hostility, and that just increased, and the British had an increasingly difficult job of governing the country. They'd actually given promises to the Jews to find a homeland for the Jewish people, and they'd also given promises to the Arab peoples of that area that were incompatible, and they just couldn't balance the two. Initially, this is a copy of the famous Balfour Declaration, in which in 1917 it was, this expresses the intention of the British government at the time that they view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. They'll use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. That was a kind of a high point of British foreign policy from the point of view of the Jews, to say, well, yes, they're going to help facilitate this. Well, ever after that, so the real politic of the situation was that, well, they had all these Arab nations and Arab peoples to deal with, and they just found it impossible to handle that. And one side said, well, you're favouring them, and the other side said, you're favouring them, and so there was just antagonism unending and lots of trouble. So somehow they got through the Second World War, but the British had such a difficult time, including after the war, that they eventually decided to hand back the mandate. They'd been given the mandate from the League of Nations. The League of Nations was superseded by the United Nations, and the newly formed United Nations, the British said, well, look, we're going to give it back. We're no longer going to manage this land. It's impossible. You deal with it. So, and then I've already mentioned the vote of the United Nations on December 29th, 1947 to allow an independent Jewish state. Russia and allied countries had little sympathy at all for the Jews. It would seem that their yes vote was motivated by a hatred of Britain and a desire to get Britain out of the Middle East so that, well, they can achieve their foreign policy objectives from that time onwards. So that's what was motivating them, so it would seem, rather than any support of the Jews. So what this was actually, that map there shows the partition plan that the United Nations put forward. The Arabs would have the yellow bits, the Jews would have the orange bits, roughly coinciding with where there was a Jewish majority and an Arab majority at that time. You can see how that kind of corresponds, how it compares with the modern Israel. And the Jerusalem and districts around it were to be administered by the United Nations. That's a picture of David Ben-Gurion down there with his fuzzy hair. Looks a bit Einstein-like. He was also a Jew. But he was the leader, and he was the fellow who made the proclamation. Okay, so now we're up to the modern time. Sorry, that's a bit of background. Now, immediately the state of Israel was proclaimed, or actually the very next day, the Arab states, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan and Syria, all established Arab states with their established armies and everything, with contingents from Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia and Sudan, invaded with an aim to destroy the Jewish state right at the outset, as some of their leaders said, to drive the Jews into the sea. So they also said more diplomatically, yes, to reimpose peace in the area, but that was their intention. The war was actually very closely fought right from day one. There were huge sacrifices, especially on the part of the Jews. The Jews were very small in number compared to these quite large Arab forces, but because they weren't so very well coordinated with one another, whereas the Jews were actually fighting for their life, they knew they had to win at whatever cost, and so they did. Looked like Jerusalem was going to be lost, but at the last moment they made some monumental effort to keep the road to Jerusalem open. So there was a sizable minority of Jews living in Jerusalem, and they wanted to keep the connection with that. They only got the modern western part of the city, not the old part of the city, which was what was really of value to them at that time. So on the previous map, you can see how that bit of land goes in there right to the edge of Jerusalem. That was Israel prior to 1967, which we'll get to later. Oh, hang on, going the wrong way here. Sorry. So that's 1948 was the first war of independence. Now, talking about the modern history of Israel, sadly, the most significant issues in it are all conflict. They're the wars that were fought. There were several up to 1973. 1973 was really the last war that had to be fought with the Arab neighbours immediately around Jerusalem, and I'll explain why. 1948 there was this war and it was 6 months really before the dust settled. Israel repelled the invaders and survived. The first of the arms agreements was signed on the 24th of February 1949. The United Nations estimated that more than 700,000 Arabs were expelled or fled from advancing Israeli forces. Now, this is where there's a lot of heated debate about, well, what actually happened. As I've mentioned, the Jews really had their backs to the wall and they almost didn't survive. But there were the Arab governments of the day encouraged Palestinian Arabs in the land of Israel to vacate, to move aside until they wiped the Jews out. Then they could go back and, well, they never went back. They never got back. So many of them fled. Some pushed by the Israeli forces or were fearful of them. Others duly, along with that, encouraged by the Arab governments and leaders to actually move aside to some place of refuge while they dealt with the Jews, okay, and got rid of them. So that's 700,000 Arabs were expelled or fled, while 156,000 remained, so it was a minority of them who remained and became Arab citizens of Israel. There was then an influx of Holocaust survivors and Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. There's a great deal of hostility in Arab and Muslim countries to all the large Jewish minorities and communities that lived there, as I said, for centuries in those lands. Suddenly they were very badly treated, so they fled, and most of them came to Israel. Of course, they came with whatever they could take with them. They generally came in poor situations. But there were, what did I learn? I learnt that during the first 3 years, all these Jews from Arab and Muslim countries and the Holocaust survivors increased the number of Jews from the 700,000 that were there to double it, 1.4 million 3 years later. The population of Israel by 1958 rose to 2 million. Between 1948 and 1970, approximately 1.15 million Jewish refugees relocated to Israel. Of course, the way the Jews treated them was that they were integrated into society. They were given what they needed. They often lived in tents for a while, in tent cities, so on. They were found jobs, they were given things to do, they were educated, they were taught a new language, Hebrew, and so on. And so they integrated into society, and from a very low beginning, rose and rose until they are now fully a part of Israeli society. It's completely different for the Arab refugees. They were kept locked up in squalid refugee camps, and for political purposes kept separate from the rest of the Arab population in the whole district around until current day. And many of them are still in that sort of situation, and where it's just a place where resentment and hatred just festers and just goes on because nobody in that area is caring for them. The population today in Israel, by comparison, is estimated to be 9.1 million people. In that tiny land, 9.1 million people. That's pretty far greater density population than Australia. And of that 9 million, 74% are Jews. And of those Jews, 3/4 of them were actually born in Israel, and the rest have been born somewhere else. So there's 74% Jews, there's 21% Arabs, and that means there's 5% others. So anyway, so that's the proportion. And it's interesting too that 92% of the population is urbanised. The first city, in terms of city numbers, is actually Jerusalem, then Tel Aviv, and then Haifa. But actually, when you consider the metropolitan area, not just the municipality, but the metropolitan area, Tel Aviv is by far the biggest. It's got a population of about 3 million in a sort of identifiable city area around Tel Aviv. And then Jerusalem's the second, and Haifa the third. Well, another thing, the immigration peaks to Israel, there have been two. The first one was in 1949, immediately after the state was proclaimed, and people had to flee there, either from Europe or from Muslim countries. The second peak was in 1990, and that's when Russia opened the doors and finally said, all you Jews, you can go if you want to. So people went from there to various other countries, including America. Many of them went to Israel. So today, in Israel, there's a very sizable proportion of people, both the original lot and more recent lot, that have come from Russia. Russia is very widely spoken in Israel. It's actually the second most common language in Israel. So when I was there, I'd go down along the beach and you'd see signs up, Hebrew, Arabic, English, Russian, saying, don't swim here or whatever, whatever, street signs and things like that. You see Russian on shop window fronts as well. So, now, what did I wanted to go on? Yeah, so I've talked about the Arab-Israeli War. In '56, there was the Suez Crisis. There was an attempt to really strangle Israel. What happened was that the Arabs nationalised the Suez Canal, which was a very important international waterway, built by the British and the French and run by them for a long time after it. They just took it, the Egyptians took it over, and I don't think compensated them properly, of course. They'd worked out they wanted to get it back. The Israelis went into some secret alliance with the French and the British. The Israelis got hold of the Sinai Peninsula. And when the Egypt had it under their control, well, they blocked it to any shipping to do with Israel. So, and they also blocked down here. See that bit there, the Straits of Tiran. So any Israeli shipping going out through its southern port there at Eilat couldn't get through here. It was strangled by the Egyptians. So they blocked it there and they blocked the Suez Canal. So it really was going to dramatically affect Israel's ability to survive in the world. It was a hostile act. So the Jews got in league with the French and the British. They took the Sinai Peninsula to relieve the Straits of Tiran. They got to the Suez Canal. But anyway, it all had to be handed back. The United Nations decided that. So that didn't really get anywhere. It did actually stop further infiltration of their borders from terrorism, because there's regularly terrorism to do with around the borders of Israel. In 1967, there was another attempt to strangle Israel, blockades and very hostile amid hostile statements. There was the uniting of Egypt on the southern flank with Syria on the north, and then Jordan joined in, and they were all getting ready to attack Israel. This was a very significant time in my own life. I was a teenager at the time, and in the community I was in, we really thought this was Armageddon and the end of the world, and so it was very dramatic. And then there was the 6-Day War. Israel was the first one to strike. They did a preemptive strike. In one day they knocked out the Air Force of Egypt, so they had superiority in the air right from the very start. And then it was dramatic. Moshe Dayan, who's this character here with the eye patch on, he was their hero from that time. He wasn't Prime Minister, but he led the armed forces basically, and great strategy. And with their courage and determination, there was dramatic reversal of fortunes on all fronts, including the Syrian. So that stage, that's when Israel took over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip. They took over the Sinai. They took over the Golan Heights, and tried to use these things as a means to negotiate with the enemy, with the enemy states around, to achieve some kind of peace. Now, sorry, I better keep going on here. So then it was 67, and then so following that, I think they had such a phenomenal success. There was a great deal of hubris in Israel. They thought, well, they're just invincible, and they were very powerful, but they they had this hubris, and they were trying to negotiate. They got nowhere with any negotiations. None of the neighbours would make any kind of peace with Israel. So there'd just be no settlement at all. So, and anyway, it would seem that Israel became a bit complacent. This is looking, with hindsight, looking back on this. In 73, the others around quite secretly, made their plans and began them. They went on the Yom Kippur, which is the most holy day of the Jewish year, when everybody's off going to the synagogue, and it came at a time, took them by surprise, surprisingly, and so Israel lost a lot more, especially initially in that war, before they managed to get the upper hand and win back, and the war came to an end. In some strange way, even though Israel had once again survived and successfully finished the war, it did give some kind of kudos to those Arab nations. And so perhaps it was that put them in a position where they were prepared just to negotiate something. So following that time, there were some peace agreements with other places. Now look, I'll just skip over the other ones. In 1976, there was a very famous incident, a hijack of an Air France plane in Athens, carrying mainly Jews, by Palestinian terrorists. It was the era of a lot of hijackings of planes and blowing up planes on the tarmac and taking hostages and so on. And they flew all the way down to Entebbe, which is in Uganda, where President Idi Amin was in power. He reckoned he was going to sort of negotiate between the two groups. He was really in league with the Palestinians. But anyway, Israel was in a great quandary what to do. They had about the hostages, the other hostages, non-Jewish. It's interesting that a lot of them were citizens of Israel, so they kept them as hostages. But there were citizens of other places like America, some Jewish, who were not Israelis, but they were treated just the same. This is how it's basically anti-Semitism in action. It's not just that they don't like Israel, they actually don't like Jews. So they kept all them, they let other hostages go, the nationals of other countries who were on this plane, and kept this 100 group, and they kept them in the airport down there at Entebbe. Well, the Israeli military did a very daring raid all that distance down there secretly at night and took them by surprise and got nearly all of the hostages out. I think about 3 died out of 100, and one of their commandos in the operation was died. Interestingly, the brother of the current Prime Minister of Israel, a fellow called Netanyahu, he died in that operation. He was the one leading captain or whatever who died. But all the others, many Ugandan soldiers and the terrorists too, were killed. Amazingly, the hostages were all freed as a group and all taken back to Israel. So it was a great public affairs victory and genuine victory for Israel. It's been made into a film and everything. That's victory at Entebbe. In 1982, there was the Lebanon War. Now, this was a war that, it's called a war. Israel, this fellow here, Menachem Begin, was Prime Minister at the time. He, with his army commander, Ariel Sharon, decided to invade Lebanon because there were so many terrorists up there who were constantly firing rockets and trying to infiltrate the border and terrorise that region up there. And so they invaded them to drive them off further. So they all went from there to Tunisia. Actually, at that stage, got them out of Lebanon or out of the border areas of Lebanon. They've since returned. These things just go on and on. So that's the wars. Unfortunately, that really is the kind of modern history. I'll just touch on some other things. As a broad sweeping statement, the Labour Party, the left wing, formed the early governments in Israel, and as I've mentioned, they had this strong collectivist idea, communism in action, and so there's great social cohesion, and it was around Labour, but very secular. The European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, were the ones who really had control. Those who'd come from the Middle East were sort of down on the scale somehow or other. But from that day on, there's been a gradual shift away from socialism to more freedom as we have it in the West, free enterprise, and so on. Israel today, and for a long, long time, has been deeply divided. It's a deeply divided country. It hangs together, and it's a wonderful place to be. But there's a religious segment, and there's a secular segment, and they are very different. There's no people in between, of course, but there's a very sizable Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox lot, and their influence and their numbers and their power and their influence is only, it grows and grows and grows. It's only ever going to grow further. There's good reason why it'll grow. They multiply for one thing, and they're just very dedicated, and they will never go anywhere else. They will always be. The secular Jews, they're very worldly, couldn't care less about the Torah or observance or anything. They just, drink, party, everything, get on, make money, of course. They all try and make money. But they just are that sort of person. And so when things get too restrictive for them and they can't stand the Orthodox lot, they'll up and off. They'll head off to US in particular, perhaps back to Australia or Europe, somewhere, and they'll live it up somewhere else. So nor do they multiply either. The other ones, the Orthodox lot, they feel it's their God-given duty to replace those who died in the Holocaust. So their numbers are strength. So, and look, I've seen families. They're, I could go. Perhaps the discussion's a place for this, but they just will be multiplying. They'll have big families. They'll have it from an early age. All their kids, they'll grow up that way. They're very strong, cohesive families and communities, and they will grow up that same way. And so eventually, it's no doubt that the religious element, which are far less compromising than the secular lot, they will grow and grow in Israel. There is a peace of sorts with Israel from 1979. Agreements were signed, and with Jordan from 1994, but never been with Syria. There was some exploration of that, and Lebanon's actually under Syrian domination. It's no longer, hasn't been an independent country for a long, long time. So we know what happened to Syria. There'd hardly be anything to negotiate with anymore. But it does have a peace with Israel and Jordan. There are diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and with Palestine too. And there's unofficial relations, these are all increasing. A lot of this is all kept quiet pretty much, but they definitely are relations with Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Morocco and Tunisia. And there are free trade agreements with a whole host of countries, including the big ones in the world like the USA and the European Union and many others in the West, Canada and so on. But there's also free trade agreements between Israel and Turkey, Jordan, Egypt. But there's hostility, and that doesn't seem to go away. It seems to get more and more all the time between Israel and Iran and Syria. Strangely, it might seem strange, but gradually the heat in the relations between Israel and some of the Arab states, like the Gulf states, is diminishing. The heat's going down. They're gradually working out how they can carefully cooperate with one another to a degree. But the real enemy is Iran. So Israel's siding with the Arab lot against the Iranian power. So that's it. Pardon? What about Iraq?
It's not mentioned here, they antagonists.
No, but there's no actual peace with them either. There's no agreement, as far as I know. Okay, now just go one further. I just thought I'd talk about their economy because they are growing in strength all the time. Early on, the exports were mainly agricultural. They were very dedicated to agriculture. It's a pretty dry land overall, but they've been very innovative with water conservation techniques. They invented drip irrigation, and they're at the forefront of desalination and recycling techniques. Particularly with reverse osmosis. Apparently they got the biggest reverse osmosis plant in the world, and recently 40% of all Israel's water needs were supplied by desalination. So they're not really in trouble with water anymore, despite it being such a dry land. It's one of the few countries in the world where there's an increasing amount of vegetation every year. They plant trees and get them growing, and rather than chopping them down. But now it's shifted from agriculture to much high-tech industry and R&D. And I wanted to tell you a few things about it. Yeah, they've got few natural resources, but they've had intensive development of agriculture and industry. They're largely self-sufficient in food production, that huge population, that tiny land. Their exports are $60 billion a year. Their leading exports include machinery and equipment, software. They're really very innovative and dynamic country. And just talking about that kind of area, software and high tech generally, Israel has the second largest number of startup companies in the world after the USA, especially in software, communications and the life sciences too. There's much research and development in the country. For example, Intel are set up there, Microsoft and a whole host of others, particularly in that area, the IT area. Israel is the first in the world in expenditure on R&D generally as a percentage of GDP. 140 scientists, technicians and engineers per 10,000 employees apparently. With that measure, it's the highest in the world. By comparison, the USA has got 85. So they're very clever people. They've focused on education, on innovation, on research and development. It's a dynamic country. Israel actually began producing natural gas because one of its shortages was energy all along, but it's been producing natural gas from its own offshore gas fields. They were discovered in 2004 and developed, and since then 2 more significant fields have been discovered in 2009 and 2010 and developed, making the country energy secure for more than 50 years into the future. So where there was a kind of a bit of a stranglehold in terms of water, and then also in terms of energy, they've overcome those problems, and they're very powerful now. They did have one failure. Apparently earlier this year I got quite interested in the fact that they were sending a spacecraft to the moon, Bereshit it was called, but it actually crash landed. They would have been the 4th nation of the world. First of all, the Russians were first to land a craft on the moon, I believe, then the Americans. The Americans are the only ones who sent people to the moon, people orbiting the moon and landing on it. And then there's been the Chinese. The Chinese have actually landed a craft on the moon, and then it was going to be the Israelis, but sadly it crashed. So they can't do everything. Okay, now sorry that's been rushed, especially at the end, but I want to just summarise rather than draw a conclusion. But I'll just summarise in this way: the Jewish people have been in existence for well over 3,000 years. They had an independent state for 500 years, state or states. For 500 years in the land of Israel, with Jerusalem as its capital. As the Assyrian, the Babylonian and the Roman conquests resulted in that ending and Jews being dispersed.
My question is, what proportion of people in Palestine in 1947-48 were Jews?
I think I gave that number somewhere along the lines. Was it 700,000? 700,000 Jews? Let me just get my notes. Up until that time, there had been quite a bit of immigration into the land, particularly after the war. People were fleeing Europe. There was a particular incident that focused world attention. There's a ship, I think it was called the Exodus actually. All these Jewish refugees from the Holocaust situation, they came from just camps in Germany and elsewhere, and the British would not let them land because they were trying to curry favour with the Arab lot. The Arab lot didn't want any more Jews in the land. They could see the Jews' numbers increasing more than their own, so they feared it was all to do with numbers, and they didn't want them to come. So this ship tried to dock and release all these people who were literally Holocaust survivors, so you can imagine their condition. They were not allowed to, and they were sent back to, of all places, Germany. And so world opinion was outraged at this, and so Britain just could not win. They felt they were this is why they ended up giving up the mandate. They just could not manage what was going on. The Jews trying to come into the land, a lot of the world sympathising with them, particularly after the war when the Holocaust situation was revealed. The Arabs not wanting them to come because they would change the balance of numbers. So it's pretty evenly divided about that time, 45 to 47. Even though there'd been restrictions on Jews coming into the country in the years before that. I think at the time of 1948, I think I said there were 700,000 Jews. Is that right?
Out of what total population?
Well, I guess double that probably.
Yeah,
I think it was pretty, overall it was evenly divided. And there were areas of Arab majority and areas of Jewish majority. And the United Nations decided to partition the land, more or less. They had some inquiry to do all this, to work out, well, where do we draw the boundaries? Would have been pretty difficult to manage. And then they said, well, Jerusalem will make an international city because it was important to both the Jews and the Arabs. So that was their intention. Now, it might not have been very workable, but the Jews said, okay, we'll have it, whatever they could get, they would have. The Arabs, this is the difference in mentality between the two sides. The Jews are great negotiators, so if they can get 50% of what they want, they'll have it. The Arabs, on the other hand, their way has appeared to be all the way along, unless we get 100%, we're not going to settle for 90%. So that's just the way negotiations never get anywhere over decades and decades. So I think it's about half, roughly, in that time.
And if you took away the recent immigration preceding that date, but the Jews have been sizable number of Jews have been living there for centuries, is that right?
No, if you go back before, in 1800, there was somebody said how many Jews there were in 1800. Was it 6,500 or something?
7.7.
Tiny.
So, I'm just trying to understand this from an Arab point of view, where they see an influx and their country or their territory being taken over by
The thing to bear in mind is
people of alien beliefs and alien culture.
The thing is, they did. You can sympathise with them. They'd been there for some of them had been there for generations. As the Jews were settling in there, so some Arabs actually came into the area because the Jews were industrious and they worked the land in a way that it hadn't been worked. They were much more Western in their ways and their thinking overall. So they developed things, and so that actually did give opportunities for some Arabs associated with that, labour and other things. So Arabs might come into that area as well, attracted by Jewish enterprise and industry. But you can understand why they would not like it. However, you've got to see this in context. Here at that time, how many Arab countries are there in the world? They stretch from Morocco all across North Africa, all the Middle East, going over towards Persia, all down to the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and everything. They're Arab countries. How many Jewish countries are there in the world? There's Israel. It's a tiny little country. If you measure land area or you measure population or whatever you measure, it's tiny by comparison with what the Arabs own. If you measure it instead rather than in terms of Arab and Jew, you look at it in terms of Jew versus Muslim. Well, how many Muslim majority countries are there? Stretch from Morocco through to Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia as well, Sudan, Egypt. It's just incomparable. How many Jewish states are there? Israel.
What are the roots of anti-Semitism? Because anti-Semitism has been going on way before that.
Yeah.
So
what are the roots? Well, my personal view is that it's actually people hate God. That's really what it is. Not that the Jews have a hold on God, but because the Jews have had a special purpose in God's plan, like it or not, and they haven't fulfilled His intention for them, but they were the chosen people. People hate that. How can these people be chosen? Look at them. They're not better than me. Oh, I don't like that. And they really hate God, so they hate God's chosen people. I think that's it. And then focuses on the fact, well, the Jews rejected Christ. So then that becomes an excuse rather than think, well, here's an opportunity for Christians to evangelise and to show the spirit of Christ to our unbelieving neighbours. No, they say, these Jews, they're not one of us. So and this is how it's been now through the centuries in both Catholic lands and also Orthodox lands, and worse there than in Islamic lands. And also not only Catholic and Orthodox, but also sadly, closer to our heritage, lands where Lutheranism has held sway as well. It's all just fed in. There's latent anti-Semitism right through Europe and Russia. It's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Geoff, my wife introduced me to historical fiction, and it's a terrific series by the Messianic Jew Bodhi Taney on life in Palestine in the late 1940s.
Okay.
It's a 5-book series, but it gives a fascinating insight into the dynamics of the Arab-Jew conflict, and of course it mentions, Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion and others. They all feature in this thing, so it's very thoroughly researched. And it's a fascinating read. I forget what the series is called now, but there's another series to do in Europe before and during World War II. Yeah. But this is in the late 1940s, a separate series.
Okay, I'd love to read those. I have not heard that name. Yeah. I've read fiction of some Jewish writers. I've read Amos Oz, he's a more modern Jewish writer. I've read Chaim Potok. Chaim Potok, I think he's dead now, but he wrote a book called The Chosen, and that was a very illuminating, and what that described was, as I remember, it was the experience of young Jewish men growing up, I think in New York. It's all set in New York. But one of them's from an Orthodox background, strongly Orthodox background, the other's more secular. They think they're mates, they're playing basketball and everything together like your lads do. But when it came to the creation of the State of Israel, the secular guy was jubilant about this, Israel created, hooray. And the Orthodox guy was really against it. This is a surprising thing because there are some Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, even today, who do not recognise the State of Israel. They say it's only Messiah who can create the State of Israel. The Messiah hasn't come yet. We're looking for Messiah. So they're kind of very awkward in Israel today. They're only a tiny minority. But then there's a lot of people in the spectrum from that through Orthodoxy. Can I just comment about I said that, as I see it, the Arab peoples have pretty largely lost the time when they'll get a decent outcome from Israel, because Israel is changing year by year by year. It's becoming more orthodox, and there's good reason for this. It's because the Orthodox lot, I've said that they have a God-given, that they feel it's a God-given duty to procreate. So they get married as young as they reasonably can. They'll have as many children as they can. They'll bring those children. They're not worried. They're not interested in having luxurious holidays here and there, even though they do get on financially. But that's not their interest. Their interest is in educating their kids to establish them and particularly in their way of thinking, religion-wise and culture-wise. So they, in turn, marry young, have kids. And when I've seen such families, I kind of got the feel that, I kind of got the idea that, such families would be very oppressive, all strong, and the man would be there with his mates, talking about the Torah and arguing about some point, and who cares about the kids, the women's job. It's actually not like that. You walk around the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or anywhere, you encounter an Orthodox family, and they don't engage foreigners. They never actually look properly. They won't do anything disrespectful to you, or if you need help, they'll help you or whatever, but they don't really engage. They're not friendly in that way. But they're there with their wife and kids, and the man is as much with the kids as the wife is. He'll be pushing the pusher with some kid and the woman holding the child's hand. And the men and the women, I've never seen fractious relationships with them. They're just, the woman's always demurely dressed in a way similar, a similar modesty to Arab women, but different. The woman covers her hair all the time in public. Some hair might be showing. It's not as strict in that sense as Muslim headdress, but they're very respectful. Skirts down here, always very, very modestly dressed, and they're very demure, and they're looking after their kids. The kids have behaved. The kids might be playing in the park and everything, they'll be with their radio control car or on a swing or whatever, just the same as any other kids. But they're very cohesive, and you have to say, well, they're bringing up their kids decently. And
Where does Netanyahu stand in all this? Sorry.
oh, he's not actually an Orthodox Jew. He's been the second longest serving Prime Minister of Israel. I think his position's a little shaky right at the moment, but he's been a very effective Prime Minister. And the way Israel runs, it's a single house parliament, unlike our own. They do have a president who's got some reserve powers, but it's pretty much a figurehead. Prime Minister has all the power, really, runs the government. There's 120 members in the Knesset. It's proportional voting, so anybody who can get 2% of the population to vote for them will get in. So there's Arab members there, a good many Arab members. There's Muslim people there, there's Druze, there's all manner of minorities. And the way that works is that you're going to have 2 or 3 pretty big parties, but unlikely to be able to form government in their own right. So they have to negotiate, and the negotiation can go on interminably, because they'll get the next biggest party trying to negotiate, well, what do you want, what can I give? And then you'll end up, well, how many numbers have we got? Have we got the 50% yet? No, we need another party, and you'll be a party with just 2 members, and the ones with the minor parties, they get in a very powerful position. It's a bit like that in our Senate here. That's their only house. All their government is like that. So it's a lot of argy-bargy, and they're great at that. And Netanyahu is able to manage it. He's a member of Likud, I think. So the Labor Party, who were very dominant, either in their own right or with a number of others who are similar and able to form government in the early days, they've gradually gone downhill, and the Orthodox parties, it changed in the time of Begin, Menachem Begin. He was the one who was Prime Minister at the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. He was also the one who made peace with Egypt. That was when the breakthrough came with Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated for his part in it, but sadly. But Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel, with the aid of, who was it? It was Jimmy Carter, wasn't it? The United States President. He got them together at Camp David and argue. They eventually came together, and that was the Camp David agreements. That was the first peace agreement. And I don't think the Arab nations around there will ever go to Israel with war with Israel again, because Israel is very powerful. They've got nuclear weapons too, which they never admit to. But besides that, just as a backup, they are very powerful anyway. They've got immense strength there, and the Arab nations would just, they know they'd not manage it. So,
what about Russia? What do I think of them?
Russia's different, yeah. But what I was going to say, the peoples within the Arab countries, their tactic for the last 50 plus years has been terrorism and terrorist incidents and so on. And that they will never succeed either, but they're a constant irritant because they fly these rockets over, or they send incendiary devices, they try and break through the border at night and sneak in and kill a few people, or they try and jump up in a marketplace and shoot a few people, but they'll never get anywhere because the whole country, I've been there, it's there's just soldiers everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and it's very confronting when you first see it, all these weapons, including what look like, girls younger than my daughters, and some of them fairly slight. They've got a big semi-automatic weapon on their shoulder. They ride in buses, they ride in trains, they're everywhere. So you could never stop terrorism, but it would never ever get anywhere, because in the moment it begins, there'd be people everywhere with guns, and that's not to say it wouldn't be unpleasant. But you actually got more chance of being caught by terrorists, I think, in London or Paris than you would have in Tel Aviv these days. Excuse me.
Sandra, you...
Well, I just want to make a comment. We've been to Israel about 5 years ago. And just on the Orthodox Jews, we happened to be walking in Jerusalem, and we happened upon a neighbourhood where Orthodox Jews live. There were big signs telling everybody to keep out.
Was that near Shirim? Okay, that's the area that would be very strictly Orthodox, like, yeah.
But, and I don't know if we're going to walk there anyway, but certainly we weren't welcome. But there were families there, and the appearance, just looking at the people, something just struck me. I couldn't put my finger on it. I finally worked it out. All the women had the same haircut and the same hair. They must have all been wearing wigs. It was identical. Every woman had the same.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting. As a woman, I found that very interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing is they don't pay tax. And my husband can elaborate if you want to know more about that, but that is an interesting fact, I thought.
Who, the Orthodox lot, no?
The Orthodox do not pay tax. The others do.
There's a lot of contention in Israel about another matter, and that's conscription, because every Jewish youth, when they turn 18, are conscripted.
Yes.
The males serve 2 years and 8 months in the armed forces, and females are conscripted too. They do 2 years. After they finish, many of them have to do, well, the males at least, have to do reserve training every year until they're about 45 or something. So Israel has a huge number of people under arms at any time, and an even huge number of reserves. They're they're one of the countries of the world with the highest proportion of militarily trained people, citizens. So, and
it's unnerving. You sit in a cafe and all the kids look the same as the kids here until you notice they've all got guns on.
Yeah, and they, the ones you see are 18 to 20-year-olds. Some of them look like kids.
They do.
And
Now,
from my point of view.
It's just like you would find in any cafe in Australia, except
the guns, yeah. But there's an issue because the Orthodox, those training for rabbi school or something or other, and some other Orthodox areas get exemption. And this is a contentious issue in Israel, has been for a long time, and they're trying to change that. There's some other exemptions as well, but that's the biggest one and the most contentious one. So once again, that's favouring the growth of orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Well, I can't serve in the army. I've got to go and study the Torah.
procreate.
And procreate. Yeah, but I actually, I was aware of some of these things before I went to Israel, but I was surprised at how they came across to me, the Orthodox lot, differently from what I thought.
So, I'm comfortable with the Jews being part of God's grand plan, and Israel having a special place and Jews needing to be somewhere. What I'm really uncomfortable with is the sort of almost adoration of the Jewish people and the country by a lot of evangelical Christians in the world. Yeah. And they're sort of carte blanche to do whatever they want, rather than to remain true to God's way of doing things.
Yeah.
And I'm uncomfortable with that, but I'm in
in
a minority in being uncomfortable. So can you comment on that?
Well, I call myself evangelical, but I'm also not. I don't think I ever, in my mind, give a carte blanche to Israel. They're a nation, they're people, they're human beings, they're political they make compromises, and I actually think overall Israel's done a pretty good job, especially in the circumstances. And I actually think that it's not like it's painted. I was saying this to somebody else earlier, the Arabs in Israel are better off in Israel than they are in just about any other Arab country. They've got more security, they've got better education, they've got better healthcare, they've got better everything. They've got better opportunity for business, they've got freedom to worship in the way they want to, in safety that they wouldn't have in many Arab countries. They might if they were in the majority in that country, but if they're a minority, if they're Shia, say in a Sunni country, they'd be anxious about attacks on their mosque and their community association and everything. In Israel, they're not worried at all. They're providing they abide by the law, don't inflict themselves on other people. They're free to worship in the way they choose, and they're free to have their associations and their schools and so on, and their cultural things. And so they are. And Israel's a country of great diversity. Itself, I've heard Israel. They're three-quarters Jewish, but it's the most multicultural country in the world. So, because Jews have come from everywhere, including even Ethiopia, and you see ones that you think are African. But they brought all their food and their culture and their music and everything with them from all the Arab countries they've come from all the European countries, from the Russian countries, from wherever they've come. They've taken things with them. It's a very interesting country.
You mentioned Arab refugee camps, so didn't you?
Yep.
How does that gel with the kind of the freedom that the Arab people have? Are they still around?
No, they're not in Israel. They're in Arab countries, and they've been kept for political purposes. So, for those Arabs that fled, when the Arab government said, well, they're going to wipe the Jews out, and then you'll be able to go back home, and they never went back home. Well, they're over in Jordan and Lebanon and Gaza Strip. There's where the refugee camps are, and they've been kept there rather than let those people freely mix with those societies in the huge Arab and Muslim world. No, they've been kept there, kept in miserable conditions and fed hatred and everything for political purposes. It's just completely the opposite in Israel. All these refugees come out of a terror situation into Israel from the Arab countries. They have to leave so much behind. They've come, many of them are poor and traumatised and everything. They're integrated into society. They're helped and they've found jobs, they've found accommodation. They start from a low level, they work up. And so they're fully part of society. And, it's just completely different.
Geoff, it sounds like Arab Muslims are better off than Christians in Israel. What about the church in Israel? Is it?
Yeah, well, they're not under physical threat, but the Jews who what you call Messianic Jews, I've met some, I've been in some such assemblies. There's constant pressure on them, and again, the Orthodox, the strongly Orthodox Jew, they're quite what you call evangelistic in their ways. They won't leave a non-Orthodox Jew alone. They'll be at them. You need to follow the law. You need to be at synagogue. You need to read the Torah. You need to wear the skull cap. You need to everything else, the prayer tassels and everything else. You need to be properly Orthodox Jew. Otherwise, in their view, you're not really Jewish. So they're quite, and that's another way they grow, not only by physical procreation, but anyone they find who's not one of them that's Jewish, so well, you've left your heritage. You need to get back to your heritage. And they'll be at them and at them and at them. And as for some Jew that becomes Christian, in their view, well, that's they've got to be at them. And so the Jewish Christians, who are a small number but growing, they don't suffer physical persecution, but they suffer pressure in other ways. Cultural pressure.
Non-Jewish Christians.
Non-Jewish. Well, the Jewish people, the fact that you and I are Christian and go there, they don't care at all. Well, that's great. You go there and, you'll be a tourist of the country. You want to go there to see things connected with Jesus and the Bible. Well, that's great. And because... we'll accommodate you and feed you and everything. And, well, that's fine. And we're very happy for you to meet together with fellow Christians and worship and pray here or whatever. That's fine. But no, they don't like Jews doing that. They don't want Jews doing that. So... And from their point of view, you can understand that. So that's how it is.
How should we view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict then, from a Christian point of view?
How should we view it? Well, it's very sad. Look, I've got no easy answer to that. I actually, personally, I feel very sympathetic to the Jewish people and to Israel. I always have. But that doesn't mean that I'm not unsympathetic to the Arab peoples. There's a lot I like about the Arab peoples. I've been in Arab countries. A lot of Arab people are really lovely, and in some ways they're more hospitable. The Jews haven't got a great reputation for hospitality. That's maybe understandable given all their history. The Arabs can be very hospitable, very lovely people. And there's things about their culture that I like in their countries. So I'm not unsympathetic to Arab, nor am I unsympathetic to Muslim people. I've got quite a few Muslim connections and happy for that. But I do think that it's very sad. But then that's the world, that's the human condition.
You made that point that they've got a lot of places they can go.
That's true.
So is it more of an Arab issue where they're not, like you're saying, they're not assimilating those people?
This is like the ones who've been dispossessed, so they say. Yeah, they've been pawns. They've been political pawns.
Is that what's happening at the Golan Heights or whatever? Where they're all
The Golan
settled?
Heights, that's the area with Syria. Israel's actually annexed that, not recognised by most of the world, but that whole area was very, very sparsely populated, so that's not where people were. That area was strategic. The strategic value of it's less now because of the way in which technology has developed. But back at the time of 67, that area was high up. Sea of Galilee, right adjacent to it, which was where Israel had most of the Sea of Galilee and the productive lands around it, very low down. It's below sea level, in fact. So the Syrians all sitting up there with their armoured positions and everything could just shoot down there all the time, which they did. And then when Israel took that, they didn't want to give it back because Syria wouldn't come to a peace. So Syria has never properly negotiated with Israel. So Israel stayed occupying the Golan Heights. And now, it's more than 50 years since that war, so we're having it. So, and look at the Syria, there's nowhere to negotiate with these days.
Palestinians claim that Jewish people have taken over land and displaced them housing. And so, what's behind that? So, can you give some...
Well, at the time of 1948, when the War of Independence and into 49, yes, I'm sure things like that did happen. Like I said,
they claim it happens now.
You know, they come in with bulldozers and bulldoze the houses down. What's that? Is it
well, I think this is to do with how the Jewish authorities try to dispense some justice to those who've been convicted of terrorism, because they're really it's a very difficult issue, and actually. It doesn't seem to be a big thing. That's not how Israel's expanding. They're always saying, well, Israel's expansionist and everything. It's not really in that way, I don't think. That's not to say they haven't got some grievances.
One observation, and you're seeing it a lot in social media and at uni, the lack of understanding of the PLO and everything. Yeah. Because one of the things that people are not a lot aware of is when the PLO was founded, its only aim was to destroy Israel. Yeah, and not a lot of people are fully aware of the actual history. You know, in a sense, Israel is like Poland. Poland for centuries didn't exist as a country, and it came back. And a lot of secular people, you know, when I'm at uni, or if you're looking at Facebook, and they're attacking Israel, and they're, you know, PLO is brilliant, but they don't understand the history that PLO's total aim to obliterate 1972 Munich massacre. There's a real no history understanding of that conflict. Now, you know, they're looking at, you know, Israel being big, bullying, but they don't understand that Israel's been fighting for its survival since 48, and it's like the secular society here says Israel's evil, Israel's bad, you know, peace for Palestine, but there is no knowledge of the history of it. And if you point out to them, I was in a tutorial when we were looking at the whole PLO, how it founded, and I was about 20 people who had no clue that PLO was a terrorist organisation. No clues whatsoever, and it's like, you know, so the history isn't taught, or it's sort of swept under the carpet.
I think there's an increasing ignorance of history generally in our society. You know, I'm sure that young people, you know, this is a typical complaint of an old man, isn't it? In our day, blah blah blah, you know. But I think it's true. The kids these days just are not taught history in a connected kind of way. They're taught bits and pieces. They don't know how it connects. Not only about Israel, but about their own country. No. People have no idea, really.
Well, you've seen it with the emergence of socialism, communism. Yeah. At Flinders Uni, where I'm at, they've got the socialist alternatives, and it's like you're supporting an agency that actually murdered gays. And there is no understanding of that. So it's a sense of most of us here are well aware Berlin Wall, great ideology built to keep people in.
Yeah.
And they don't. So this ignorance of what is there. And when you point out to them, I actually met a guy who lived in Poland when it was communist, and he said, I came to Australia in 1985. All the unionists said, oh, great, communism, amen, hallelujah. And he called them stupid and literally had stand-up fights with them. Because they didn't have a clue about communism. And he then had to go at the socialist alternatives. He called them stupid because you do not have a clue. The history, you don't know the history.
This is nothing new.
No, nothing's new under the sun.
People have, people believe what they want to believe about lots of things.
Did you ever see the SBS show on Jewish rabbis going around Australia?
No.
It was really fascinating because...
How long ago was this?
Oh, about 12 months ago.
Would it be on iView? Would it be...
It could be on iView.
Okay.
But what was interesting, there was this guy who wanted to become a Jew, who was not a Jew, and they tried everything they could to dissuade him from being a Jew.
Yeah.
And I really found that really fascinating.
Yeah.
And yet there was this guy who said, oh, by the way, my mother was Jewish. Oh, do you know you were Jewish? No.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that Judaism, my understanding was originally it was meant to draw people to God, meant to be a light and they would come. But the impression you get now, and from this thing, because it was actually, there were touring rabbis going around Australia, there were about 2 or 3 of them, and they weren't sort of sharing Judaism at all. They were just going to communities looking like, like being pastors, but it was almost like, how do we become a Jew? We don't want you. Which is, I'm not
Christianity. Things have changed. That would be very interesting. I just make a couple of comments about that. One is that since the time of Christ and the beginning of the Christian church, the Jewish faith has changed. Remember how it says in the Gospel somewhere, Jesus, in criticising them, he says, you will travel over oceans in order to get one proselyte, to come into the Jewish. That changed because with the coming of Christ, it's all changed. They no longer, for the last 2,000 years, they haven't been proselytising. They're trying to preserve their own, but they don't want anybody to come and join them. If you're not Jewish, they're not interested. You can do whatever you like,
And that was the thing that came out of this SBS show.
That's right.
It actually came out.
But the other thing I'll mention too, I've also done another online course recently, which was really interesting. That was about the Mishnah, the Jewish, the traditional Jewish scriptures, that the voluminous things of Rabbi says, Rabbi X says this, Rabbi Y says that, and going to the minutiae of the law. And honestly, I did all that. It's quite a thing. 8 weeks of online course at some American university with Jewish studies. What do they call it? So it's the Talmud, all the Jewish commentaries on the scriptures. But my impression overall with that, besides the fact that it's mind-boggling, is that God is almost irrelevant. It's actually about the law, and what does the law actually mean? Why this word here? And could that mean something? If there's a gap missing there, well, let's argue about that gap. Should this apply or should that apply? And Rabbi X will say this, and then Rabbi Z will come along and say, oh, there's another one. And this is what it's all about that. And God is pretty much irrelevant. It's not really about God. It's about cleverness in words and dissecting argument. Sorry about lawyers, but it's very lawyer-like.
It says in Titus that there is no profit in arguments about the law. But I can tell you as a lawyer of 35 years, that's not right.
But it really is no longer, it's not about, it's not like any Christian faith, really.
Do you think it's become a religion of hate? I had a friend many years ago, went to a synagogue, and the message he got was remember the Holocaust, and it was very much a hate thing. This was his experience. He'd heard the message, remember the Holocaust, and it was very much...
I don't think it's hate.
That was his experience.
If you were a Jew, heck, I'd be pretty aware of the Holocaust too. I feel like I am anyway, and I'm not Jewish. And I've been to Israel, I've been to the Holocaust, I've been to several Holocaust memorial places, and the one in Israel is the biggest near Jerusalem, but I've been to ones in other places too, like Berlin, for example. But you can't, they would be very wary of other people, and the more aligned they are with their Jewish heritage, the more they're going to be, you're not Jewish, I can't really trust you. You know, I'll do a deal with you, you know, you sell me this and I'll pay that, and etc., and I have to live next to you and we'll get on, you know. But they never really open themselves up to non-Jewish people, and that's why I have found when I've been in it, this is my impression, that I see Orthodox people, even on the street, they never really engage you. They won't do anything harmful to you. You walk past, and if you said, "Oh, excuse me, where's the post office?" they'll tell you. And if you say, if you need help or something, they'll help you. But you be my friend, and come round to my place for we'll have a drink and a chat. No way, I won't do that. You're not Jewish, so I can't really trust you. Really, that's underneath. I won't say that, but and you can understand it.
You can.
It's past 9 o'clock.